thank you all for your patience. It was a joy to get to recognize our Gopher buddies and Olympians with their awards this morning, so I do apologize for being just a little bit late. Well, a couple years ago, I got to go on a whitewater rafting trip down on the Gully River near the New River Gorge. Some of you probably have been down there in the fall. A group of our men like to go down for a white rafting water trip. And the last time we went, I was in a raft with 5 other guys and a guide, and we kind of determined at the outset that we were going to go big or go home. All right, the first Class 5 rapid, called Pillow Rock, is a big rock up on the side of the river, and if you hit the water just right leading up to this rock, you can actually jump the raft out of the water if you have enough force, and the goal is to actually take your paddles and slap on top of the rock, and that's a challenge. And he said, is this video? Do I need to stay over here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Stay within the drill.
Man, this is really gonna. Okay. All right. So Pillow Rock is right up here on our left, and we talk about it beforehand with our guide. So we're gonna paddle hard, and we're gonna get up, and we're gonna actually shoot the whole raft up on that rock. He said, if we're successful, we're also gonna capsize. All right.
If we're successful,
everybody's gonna go into the water if we do it right, which is fine. It's like, you want to get your money's worth whitewater rafting, and he said, if this is successful and if we capsize and you're in the water, don't panic. There's going to be a period of time that you're underwater. It's going to be dark. Just don't worry, you will pop up, but it might be 30 seconds. Okay. I said, wow, okay. Good to know that. Everybody's still on board? Yeah. We were in the aggressive raft here. So we went ahead and did it. We paddled hard. We went up on the rock. We all got our paddles up on the rock. The whole boat came out of the water, and sure enough, we flipped. And there was a period of time underwater where I started thinking, am I actually gonna survive this? Am I gonna come up? And if he hadn't have given me that warning, I would have been quite panicked. But I remembered his words. I remembered the guide who said, don't worry, you'll make it. And I tell you what, there was a feeling of having no control. Being in the river, being in the current, I felt like I was getting whipped around like a rag doll. Got a few scuffs from rocks. It's a little bit hard to describe, but just complete loss of control. It's like nothing I do. I'm just like, tuck my arms in, I've got a helmet on, and hope I make it, because there's nothing I can do in this situation. But the words of the guide were a great comfort. The words of the guide helped me stay calm, and it felt like a minute to me. It probably wasn't that long. It was probably like 15 or 20 seconds, but that's a long time to be underwater getting whipped around. And pretty soon I popped up, and it was like, man, that was really cool. We got our money's worth on that. Well, when we ask the question, why Daniel? Why would we teach on the book of Daniel? There's lots of reasons, of course. It's part of God's Word. It's the Bible, good book, But one thing came to mind, and that's the truth that God is in control. Amen. So if you're just kind of looking for a heading, a primary theme, God is in control. And that evokes a response from us as followers of God. And the obvious response is to find refuge in the Lord. To find refuge in the Lord. I'd like to read, before we get into Daniel, Psalm chapter 2. In seasons of our lives when we feel out of control, when we're in situations that seem dangerous, when we're in times of suffering, when we're in times of broken relationships, or whatever life brings across our path, we do well as Christians to remind ourselves that God is in control and to take refuge in Him. Let's read Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So the primary theme that I want to introduce, and I think it's even in our introductory materials, is that God is in control. And as followers of God, that ought to cause us to take refuge in him. It's interesting, Psalm 2 is quoted by the early church leaders, by the apostles, when they experience this difficulty. They go back and they cite Psalm 2. It's Peter who quotes from Psalm 2, saying, why do the nations rage? And one of the things we're going to see in the book of Daniel is lots of kings. Some pretty powerful kings, namely Nebuchadnezzar, one of the great monarchs, the greatest of the Babylonian Empire, pretty full of himself, okay, pretty great in earthly terms, and he really thought he was, powerful. Of course, when you're probably the most powerful human on the face of the earth, it can get to your head. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. A relative of his, Belshazzar, also king, exalts himself, and it's going to be interesting to see their responses to God when they're tested. They kind of both are tested, and then what happens to them based on their testing. We know Nebuchadnezzar, I don't want to steal people's thunder, but we're going to have to talk on some of the content, okay? Nebuchadnezzar, of course, as we know, is driven out. He acts like a cow. Okay? This is the most powerful king on the face of the earth, and he's running around grazing like a cow. But then he humbles himself, and he recognizes the true God. Belshazzar, right, he's drinking, he's got his party, he's at the pinnacle. In his mind, doing whatever he wants, He's the king. Using the vessels from the temple, God writes on the wall, he refuses to humble himself, and he's done. So the kings conspire, the kings rage, but ultimately, Proverbs 21, verse 1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. That brought to mind my experience, just the water course. It takes its turns, and the kings, the most powerful men of the world who think they have all this authority, they're just pawns. They're just directed wherever the King of Kings takes them. So with that, we want to focus. We want to understand that God is in control. We want to take refuge in him. Why Daniel, more specifically? A few thoughts. It's God's word. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 tells us that all Scripture is profitable for teaching, for correction, for rebuke, for training in righteousness. It inspires hope and offers comfort for God's people. So as we dig into this concept of God being in control, and we look at specific instances in Daniel's time, and we look at the prophecy that has already been fulfilled, and then as we consider prophecy about the future, we ought to find hope as followers of the one true God and as believers in the truth that God is in control. And we ought to find comfort as we find refuge in him. It models, the book of Daniel will model a righteousness in a pagan land during difficult times. We have to be careful about taking Old Testament characters, have to be careful about taking them and then elevating them and saying, well, so-and-so did this, therefore I should do that. We need to be careful with that. We need to look at the context because the Old Testament is largely narrative. And people do a lot of terrible things, evil things, wrong things that are described in the narrative. But Daniel is consistently held out as a righteous man, and really he's unique in that we don't really read anything bad about Daniel. Watch that in the book as we go through it. Nothing really that I can find that's a negative reference to Daniel. David is the standard by which all future kings are measured in the Old Testament, and he's got a lot of junk. Okay, his life's kind of a mess. The patriarchs, they're exemplary in some ways, but man, their lives are a mess. Even Joseph, to some extent, has in his early days, some things that a little pride-ish, some issues. Daniel, really nothing negative. So he is held out as a righteous man, and it's interesting where he's living. He's living in a pagan land. He's living in a godless society. Actually in captivity and being under a brainwashing program where he's being reprogrammed by the king of Babylon. And yet he's a righteous man who maintains his integrity and is actually used of God, as we'll see, in mighty ways. So one of the things that we can see in the book of Daniel as believers is a model of righteousness in a pagan land. He has personal piety and discipline. He demonstrates righteousness during times of suffering, during times of loss, during times of grief. As he laments, he demonstrates righteousness in contrast to the surrounding culture. So it inspires hope, offers comfort for God's people. The book models righteousness in a pagan land during difficult times. And finally, it includes prophetic visions about the future, some of which have been fulfilled, some of which have not been fulfilled. So there's a good amount of prophecy in the end, especially chapters 7 through 12 of Daniel. If we're going to break the book down in large categories, we could say chapters 1 through 6, primarily narrative. Chapters 7 through 12, primarily prophecy, looking to the future, Daniel's various visions. So who wrote the book of Daniel? A few things. Let's just lay some ground rules here as we seek to learn from this book. What are some things that we need to know? Who wrote the book? Well, we believe that it was inspired by God. So God was sort of the ultimate author of all Scripture. But Daniel was the human author. Now, if you start reading about who wrote the book of Daniel, you'll see that it's, for a long time it was kind of uncontested. People thought it was Daniel. He identifies himself as the author. He refers to himself in the first person. But then over time, critics get in there and people start to question, and they start to question the date. And if it's a later date, then Daniel couldn't have written it. Maybe it was, written by someone else in the 2nd century. There's going to be, people have all kinds of views. If you're interested in that, I think it's a fascinating discussion. This course will be taught from the conservative traditional view that Daniel wrote the book. And I think it stands up. I mean, Jesus in Matthew 24, I believe it is, refers back to Daniel, refers to Daniel as a prophet. So, that's something that we're going to take a strong position on, and we can talk about it if you have questions. Daniel wrote it. He's the human author. When did he write it? Well, look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. It's a good time to go ahead and flip to the book of Daniel. We'll poke around a little bit. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Judah and besieged it. This is the first time marker in the book of Daniel. And we actually know when Jehoiakim reigned, and so we know that the 3rd year was 605 BC. So we're talking about 605 BC when these events took place. Jehoiakim was captured by Nebuchadnezzar in 605, and he later actually ruled in Jerusalem, but as a puppet king. So he was taken over by Nebuchadnezzar in the conquest of Judah in the first, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it was actually, Jerusalem was conquered in 3 stages. We'll talk about that a little bit, but 605 is kind of the first marking of time. That's when Jehoiakim is captured by Nebuchadnezzar, but he still serves. As long as he pays Nebuchadnezzar tribute, he still serves and reigns for a while as a puppet king. Okay. Daniel 10:1 marks the last time marker, where it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar, and the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And it goes on. That's the last time marker, the 3rd year of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great is born in 600. He basically starts the Persian Empire, which then later conquers the Medes. He actually unites the Persian and Medes. So you hear the Medes and Persians. Those were united under Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Elder. And he would then rule over Babylon. We read about his taking over Babylon, and he rules over Babylon from 539 to about 530. So we know roughly when these events are taking place, and if Daniel wrote them during his life. Probably could have been towards the end of his life, relying on his notes, relying on his journals, that kind of thing. There are some more liberal critical scholars who will argue that Daniel was written in the second century, and they'll talk about Persian loanwords and different reasons why this, but it's a big debate. Okay, but if Daniel wrote it, obviously he wrote it while he was alive in the 6th century. That's the traditional view. That's the view we'll take for purposes of this course. There are some interesting details in that. If that's something that interests you, be happy to talk with you about it. But I didn't think it'd be helpful to take everyone's time to sort of go through some of these rabbit trails. Okay, so we know why we want to learn about the book of Daniel. We've addressed some of its, some of the reasons to study it. We know the author. We know generally when the events took place. And so let's educate ourselves a little bit on what was happening at the time. What was the setting? What's going on? Because if we're going to study this book, we don't want to just study it in isolation. We want to understand it in the context of the history that's taking place at the time it was written. Sometimes it's the temptation to read biblical books and kind of read them through an American worldview and kind of our stage, and we just sort of read it and try to just apply it directly to our lives. Well, is there application for us? Absolutely, there's application. But to understand the truth, the meaning, we got to go back and understand it when it was written, and then draw that application out of the text for our lives today. So we want to take just a moment and study and remind ourselves what's happening when this book is written. So Assyria rules the ancient Near East from like 934 to 609. Assyria, you read about in the Judges, you read about in the Kings, you read about Assyria and its power. But then Babylon comes onto the scene in the late 7th century BC, led by Nebuchadnezzar, actually led by Nebuchadnezzar's father, whose name I want to try to pronounce, I probably won't pronounce it correctly. You can read it on your page there. Nabopolassar, something like that.
Sounds good.
Nabopolassar. Is that close enough? Carl's shaking his head, so I think that is a yes. So Nebuchadnezzar is actually the son of Nabopolassar, and he's off on the stage one of conquering Jerusalem when Nabopolassar dies and Nebuchadnezzar then takes over the rule of the Babylonian kingdom. Okay, I've made a list for you there on your notes of the Babylonian kings, just so you have reference. All these kings, Nebuchadnezzar, so Daniel was hauled away in captivity in 605. That's kind of where he comes on the scene. And you can see there were several different Babylonian kings who ruled while Daniel was in exile in Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem in a couple different stages. Stage 1, 605, he goes in and he takes the best of the land, the best young people. And this is where we start to think about, okay, Daniel, what was he like? How old was he? He was probably born into royalty. He's a pretty sharp guy, and he was a young person. He was a youth. Probably most Bible students estimate around 15. Some will say 12 to 15 when he was captured. So just think about that. You're 12 to 15. You're a standout. You're noted by Nebuchadnezzar. This is a guy I want to take back to my kingdom, and we're going to brainwash him, and we're going to use him there. Okay? But he's relatively young, hauled away to another land, and they basically are wiping the slate clean, giving him different food, re-education system. And you can feel the tension, the pull towards a different worldview. He could easily start to doubt God. He was raised, obviously, he had a great upbringing, but okay, he's in a different nation. He's in captivity. He's hearing all kinds of different things. He could easily doubt God. And yet Daniel is righteous. He is consistent. He is faithful to Yahweh, even in the time of captivity. So that's in 605. About 8 years later, Nebuchadnezzar goes back and pulls tradesmen, captures more people. This is when Ezekiel is taken captive. You can read about this in 2 Kings. I've got the references there in the notes, and in Ezekiel. And then the third stage is the destruction of Jerusalem. And that occurs leading into it takes a while. It's in 587 and then into 586 BC when Jerusalem is wiped out and the Jews are either killed or taken captive or subjected to complete Babylonian rule. So it's a 3-stage. Daniel's in the first stage. He's in a land of captivity. How did he write? As we think about kind of the style of Daniel, as we think about how are we going to learn from it, introductory information, how's he writing a big picture? Well, I already mentioned chapters 1 through 6 are largely historical narrative. 7 through 12 are basically prophetic vision. But another interesting fact about Daniel is it's written in different languages. Different languages. Chapters 1 through basically chapters 1 and the first couple verses of verse 2 are written in Hebrew. And chapters 7 through 12 are written in Hebrew. But the middle section of the book, which is most of the stories, are actually written in Aramaic. Aramaic was an international language. It was the common diplomatic language, the business language. It applied more so to the nations, to Jews and Gentiles alike, whereas Hebrew would have been specifically a language for God's people. So it's interesting that different languages used, people spill a lot of ink as to why that is, but one good solution would be that the first section of the book is really applicable to all nations, as it's the narrative of Daniel's life. Talks about things that are happening to multiple nations. Come on in, guys. Whereas the second half, the prophetic visions are more so related to God's people, and it's written in the Hebrew language. So why? Why does Daniel write? Well, I think a big reason is to give hope. He speaks of restoration, future restoration, through visions of God's dealing with Israel's sin during what we refer to as the times of the Gentiles. From this time where Babylonian Babylonian kingdom conquers Israel, we refer to that sort of as the times of the Gentiles. Israel is dispersed. They aren't really ruling. They don't, their kings are puppets for Babylon. And it's a difficult time in many ways in Israel's history. But Daniel writes to give hope. He gives hope, speaking of future restoration. And what does that evoke in the followers of Christ? Well, faithfulness. Faithfulness throughout the time of trial because of the hope that's coming. You think of a lot of the great leaders who are able to give hope. You think of Winston Churchill and his inspiring speeches to give hope to people even about to be subjected to Nazi attack. And what do you say to somebody to give them hope? When, this other nation's going to try to wipe you off the face of the earth, what do you say? Well, you look into the future. And you talk about the future, and you say, well, actually, this could be your finest hour. We're going to look back on this. This could be your finest hour in the case of Winston Churchill. In the case of Daniel, look into the future. The good guys win. God is still working. God still has a plan for his people, even though the time right now is difficult. Even though the time right now, Israel's really not even following God. In fact, they're rebelling against him, and God has a time of judgment. But he's prophesied that judgment. This is a fulfillment of prophecy that when Israel rejects God, they're going to be specifically, Daniel, we'll talk about that in Daniel 1, is a fulfillment of prophecy. But then he's also talking about prophecy into the future of restoration. There's a coming restoration. And what does that give? Hope. What does that inspire? Faithfulness. What was Daniel a model of? Faithfulness, righteousness in a pagan land, in times of suffering, when everybody else was following other gods. When he was in the process of being brainwashed. So he writes to give hope. He also writes to instruct. He teaches the people of God, and he admonishes the people of God in times of crisis. He teaches patience, and he teaches readiness while admonishing unfaithfulness. One of the things I appreciated, we actually went up and saw the Sight and Sound Daniel show. One of the things I appreciated about it was how Daniel longed for the people of God to live righteously and to honor Yahweh. And yet he realized, they have rejected him. And that's why this judgment is upon the people of God. That's why they're in captivity. It was predicted. We knew this was coming when Israel rejected God. God would use other nations to come in and take them captive. And yet, there's coming restoration. And so the call for the people of God is to live faithfully, to live a faithful life. What are some themes? Well, one theme is that God is holy, and his followers should imitate his character even when they're surrounded by evil. Consistently, we see that, especially throughout the first 6 chapters, and there's a call to holiness, to faithful living that's found in the hope of coming victory. But especially through the first 6 chapters, we see that God's people in a foreign land are consistently faithful. They live holy lives. Maybe the largest theme, we already kind of led with it, is God is sovereign. God is in control. It stands in contrast to the limited authority of kings. This is a theme throughout. The kings, what do kings do? They seek power. They seek control. They subject other nations. They conquer. They exalt themselves consistently. And we see some great kings rise up in this book, most notably Nebuchadnezzar. And what is the reality about these kings? They're all subject to the King of Kings, to the sovereignty of God, to the working out of his plan. This is of particular importance when considering the prevailing Gentile view that these battles between kingdoms were not just battles of the soldiers out on the front line fighting, but the view was that these were battles between the nations and also the nations' gods. So when Nebuchadnezzar conquers Judah, captures the people in Jerusalem, he believes that his gods have prevailed. His gods are greater, and Yahweh has been defeated. According to the prevailing view that, well, the kings are fighting. There's sort of this the nations are fighting against each other, but it's a test of the power of the gods. It's interesting, the theme, you'll hear this if you haven't been to the service, there's a similar theme with Pharaoh, at the time of Egypt, with Pharaoh, setting himself up and all his thousands of gods versus Yahweh. There's these big power struggles, not just at earthly kingdoms and nations, but in the cosmic realm. Okay, so the theme here is that God is sovereign is of particular significance given the thought that these kings are fighting for the gods are fighting for their people. Within that, we see that God thwarts the intentions of even the mightiest monarchs, and that the course of history unfolds in God's time. We also see, finally, a theme that God provides for his people in his own way and in his own time. It'd be easy to think in Babylon, even to be, as Daniel, living in a foreign land, a captive. You're thinking, sitting there at night, going through this education program, re-education program. You got this faith that God is in control. But then it's like, well, if God's in control, what's going on? What's happening? Well, has God forgotten? No. I just think we need that reminder. I think we need that reminder when we look around at, our leaders today sometimes and we think, what is going on? It seems like, well, if God's really in control, why is this guy doing this? He shouldn't be doing that. God's in control. Well, there's seasons. It's in God's time. And the trials of God's servants end in God's own time. That can be difficult if we're in a season of trial, difficult to hear. But I find a deep comfort in that. That God is a good God. He's a merciful God. He's a sovereign God. And in his time, these things will end, and there will be restoration. Not in our time. It takes a lot of trust. But that's a theme that we'll see consistently. And as the prophetic revelation, revelation, especially as in chapters 7 through 12, it's going to refer to many events. Some have occurred, particularly in, I believe it's chapter 7, with the four kingdoms, right? Much of that has occurred, but then there's going to be future revelation that has not yet occurred. Okay, what are some principles? What are some things that we should keep in mind before we jump into our text a little bit more and bring home some more specific application? One of the things as we go through this book is to let the text speak for itself. Let it speak. Now, it's very hard for us to do that. It's very hard for us to let the text speak for itself, because when we read it through a series of lenses, through our own life experience, through our time in history, through being an American, through being at Fellowship Bible Church, all these different things that provide lenses for us. So the real goal of interpreting the Bible is to actually peel aside these lenses and understand what the Bible is actually saying for itself, right? And then make the application for that. It can be difficult to do, but to do that, we want to take every word at its ordinary meaning, unless its immediate context clearly indicates otherwise. So when we read words, we want to understand the context, what's being said, and then let it speak. Don't read into the text, this is what we think it should say, this is what I think because I read, this other thing. Let it speak, understand the context, understand what's being said, and as we go into this chapter by chapter, we'll have more time for our teachers to uncover a little bit of the context. This is a big overview. This is like the 40,000-foot view, right? But as we go through, we'll get a little bit more into the detail of the different kings who are ruling at that time, what's happening, hopefully, and why this message is important and what it really means, what it meant then. And then we can bring that home and make application for us today. A couple of other things. Beware of double references. So one passage may speak of several, two events that are sort of blended into one picture. They might be separated by time. Watch for recurrence. There might be a second passage that provides more detail about an earlier passage. Daniel is not written in chronological order. Okay, it's written with themes. I had included, I don't think it made it into my notes, I included the actual chronology, but you'll see, like when he's going through his visions, you'll see the different, parts of it are in chronological order, parts of it are not, okay? And then, of course, finally, a text apart from its context is pretext. So beware of the context of the passage. Any questions on any of this so far? Questions, comments, criticisms?
Pretext for a proof text.
What's that?
Pretext for a proof text.
Pretext for a proof text.
That's the rest of it.
Oh, okay. Okay. I cut it off. Okay, I got you. Thanks, Scott. Okay, well, let's look at the very beginning of chapter 1. We're not going to go through chapter 1, but I just want to illustrate one point that hopefully you're picking up on our theme here of God, that God is in control. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Look at verse 2. And then he conquered the kingdom and made Judah his subjects. No. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Do you notice that right out of the get-go? Is the narrative focusing, so who's the main character of the book of Daniel?
God.
God. God is the main character. God is in control. Nebuchadnezzar, this, thought to be this great monarch, and by historical records, one of the great rulers of his time, God gave him Jehoiakim. God also made him act like a cow later, right? God gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels. And isn't it interesting that God giving Judah into his hand was predicted earlier in Scripture by the prophet Jeremiah? Okay? So that when the people of God, actually it's in Deuteronomy too, right? When Moses is, what's that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. When Moses is instructing the people of God and urging them to obey God in Deuteronomy 28 and following, let me just read a section of this. This is before they cross the promised land. This is what Moses says to the people. But it shall come about, if you will not obey the Lord your God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes with which I charge you today, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, while your eyes shall look on and yearn for them continually. But there shall be nothing you can do. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you shall set over you, to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone. And you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a taunt among the people, where the Lord will drive you. Later in verse 49, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar and from the end of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, who shall have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. So isn't it interesting that right in verse 1, this main theme of the book is confirmed when we see that the Lord gave Jehoiakim over to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And he gave him over to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, just like he said he was going to give him over to this other king, this other nation, way back before the people even came into the promised land. So we see right from the get-go this theme that there are kings that rule and they set themselves up. But at the end of the day, God is sovereign. God is in control. So, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for God's people? Living in a time where we feel like things are out of control. When you're in a river and you're being whipped around by the current, hitting some rocks along the way. It's the words of the guide that ring true. It's going to be all right. You're gonna pop up eventually. You're going to make it. And it gives us what? Hope. And it encourages us to take refuge in the Lord, as the psalmist has written. How about from some of you? Let's open it up here. What would be an example of a way that we as God's people can find refuge, can find comfort in this principle that God is in control? It's interesting to talk about it kind of in general terms. What about in specific terms? Can you think of a way, you leave here today, you learned a little bit about some Babylonian kings, you learned a little bit about Daniel being written in different languages, about the structure of the book, and hopefully one of my goals is that you'll want to come back next week. And one of my goals is that you won't just come back and sit and listen to the teaching, but that you'll actually go out this week and read the book of Daniel. 12 chapters, it doesn't take that long. When I first started prep, I just read the whole thing. You can just sit down and read the book of Daniel. It might take you, I don't know how fast you read, so. You can split it up, do 1 through 6, and then do 7 through 12. But I hope that not only will you come back and dig into this, but that you'll read it on your own and you'll come with questions and you'll try to stump people like Mark Henson, all right? Just see if you can do it, okay? Specific examples. Yes, Al.
I think about the fact that really when you look at it, you're a true child of God. No matter how difficult the challenges that we might face are, we can know that God is in control and God is teaching us something through those challenges to make us more like Jesus, and at the same time demonstrate his sovereignty over all things.
Yeah. Now, how many of you came in here kind of doubting, I don't really know that God's in control? Anybody kind of have those questions coming in? Probably you knew that. Probably this isn't, the theme of Daniel is not new information. But I think oftentimes, at least in my own life, most of the times when I mess up and sin and doubt and become discouraged, it's not because of a lack of information. So we actually need regular reminders. And do you know what? The people of God needed regular reminders. And that's the reason the book of Daniel, one of the reasons the book of Daniel was written, was to remind the people of God who are living in captivity that God is in control. And I think this is a perfect season to study the book of Daniel. As we look at, we go into an election year. This is notably a difficult time for us as Americans. Every time you come up to the election, we hear these words, this is the most important election in the history of the country. It's like, I thought the last one was. And the one before that, every year it's the most important. And if you're like me and you start having these thoughts, well, if the wrong guy, if the wrong president is elected, then I don't know if we're going to make it. Like, I think we're going to, that's what I'm tempted to think, and I'm sure some of you share those thoughts. Like, this is it. It's a cliffhanger. And so we need these reminders from books like Daniel that actually it's really not a cliffhanger. We are charged with faithfulness. Daniel is a model of faithfulness in a land that is pagan and evil and wicked. And we know the end of the story. Yes, we want to do what we can to influence our government officials. And Daniel is also someone who was used in the government of a pagan nation, okay? But primarily, the charge to us as believers is faithful living. Daniel's example of personal piety and discipline, when he prays consistently, when he opens his windows up towards Jerusalem, which is not following God even at that time. It shows his hope, his trust in Yahweh. Even in the face of being thrown into the lion's den, he opens his windows because he realizes that Cyrus isn't in charge here. Right, so it gives us boldness. How about another example, specific example, as you leave? What is it? Hopefully, I'm trying to get a couple things in your mind so that when things start to happen in your life, you'll actually think about this. It'll come to mind. Rick.
In Daniel, there are two classes of people throughout all 12 chapters. Those are the people that know that God is in control, live in light of it, and reap the rewards of it. There are those that do not know that God is in control. Mm-hmm. They learn about it. and then they reap those rewards. Those two groups of people throughout the book of Daniel are overt. They're in your face. There are huge things that happen that everybody knows. Go to the next book, Esther. In Esther, you see the exact same thing. There are two classes of people. Those that know that God is in control and live in light of it and reap the rewards, and the same thing, those that do not. But in Esther, God's not visible. He's behind the scenes. And so Daniel is this very overt, in your face, yes. And we see that in a lot of things in the world today, and we can see what God is doing. But don't depend on that, because then you got the book of Esther that footstomps that same story. It's even if you don't see it, even if you don't know what's going on, even if there's no evidence of it, know that God is in control, whether you see him or not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. Yeah, especially the example that comes to mind is, in my mind, is chapters 4 and 5, right? The Nebuchadnezzar is given kind of a test. Belshazzar is given a kind of a test. You know, they're both in some ways shown the power of God. You know, Nebuchadnezzar is driven out, and he actually turns and humbles himself, and he's restored to power in his test. And Belshazzar refuses to turn, refuses to humble himself in the face of the writing on the wall, and he's taken out that very night. He's executed. So you know, to your point, the two different kinds of people were given examples of that. Nebuchadnezzar recognizing it, learning; Belshazzar not learning.
And so the application to your question, things we can take out of here.
Yeah.
How do you all feel about that? God's in control. Do you want to live in light of it, or do you want to be humbled by it? Your choice.
Yeah, okay. One more, James.
So we kind of hit on a little bit, but to me, when I look at this, it's the trials or the struggles and living in the mess when you're in a mess that you really see God kind of taking control. You're letting go and actually growing, you know, trusting, and all the stuff that we say we do, but it happens more when we're in all the junk of life than it happens when everything's working well and, you know, we've got the job we want, everything's going well. That it's all the screw up time frame is when God is really pulling us and growing us and stretching us, and we learn to rely on him more. And I think that in Daniel, you kind of see that. That's just how it is.
Yeah. So the next passage I wanted to read to kind of bring us to kind of land the plane here soon is 2 Peter chapter 3. Because in chapter 3 of 2 Peter, he's writing about the day of the Lord that's coming. And we pick up in verse 11. So he describes similar encouragement. You can kind of see these themes. Let me just read a little bit in chapter 8. He's talking about this final judgment at the end of time, and he says, "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed." And here's verse 11. "Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be? In lives of holiness and gentleness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." So this is the response of the believer. God is in control. We don't have to worry about the kings that rage and the nations that rage against the Lord's purposes. He directs their heart like a water path. We're encouraged at the end of Psalm 2 to what? Take refuge in the Lord. And here, more specifically, the refuge is the comfort, but here's more specifically, what sort of people ought you to be? Well, living lives of holiness and godliness. So there's the call in the light of that. So in these situations, we're talking about these specific examples, when it seems like things are out of control, when things are definitely outside of my control, seek to live a holy life, a godly life, recognize that the one who's called us is faithful, that good wins in the end. And there's going to be a lot of issues in the book of Daniel, and there's some controversial things, like even who some people are, like Darius. Well, who is he? And well, there's a couple good options, but at the end of the day, I'm not really sure. Maybe Mark has a stronger position, but I'm not really sure. Maybe it's a ruler under Cyrus. Maybe it was referring to Cyrus himself. A couple different things. There's some things that we don't know, but I encourage us right at the outset to not get overly distracted by some of these little details. A lot of critics will come into Daniel and say, well, it couldn't have been written then because he couldn't have known. And by the way, Daniel wasn't really viewed as a prophet. His writings in the rabbi wrote about them as part of the writings, not the prophets. Well, Jesus refers to it as him as the prophet Daniel. So there's issues, and I think they're interesting to consider and to discuss. But let's major on the major. The theme is actually not that controversial, and it's what we need most, I think, as followers of God. We need to know that He's in control. We need to know that we can take refuge in Him, and we need to pursue holiness and godliness in our own lives. And we have the perfect example of Daniel and his friends who did that. Whatever, you can look around in America and say, it's pretty bad. It's not as bad as Babylon, okay? It's not as bad as Babylon. Living under a monarch like Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, man. Anyway, it's not as bad, and the people of God then were called to remain faithful. We see it throughout Scripture, specifically in the teaching of Peter here. And so I want us to leave thinking, there's some things that concern us. Yes, we'll see that theme of people who follow God, even influencing, government. That's good. But really our call here is to faithfulness, is to holiness, is to godliness. That's our role as Christians. That's what we want to major on. And hopefully it's a fun time learning about some of the imagery and some of the specifics, and we can scratch our heads together, try to figure out who people are and what exactly is going to happen. But in the big picture, we kind of know. We know what's going to happen. Jesus is going to come back, and the good guys win. Okay? So, any last comments? Any last points of application? We have 2 minutes. What is a specific way this week that you can grow in holiness, as Peter calls us to, that we can model maybe a characteristic of Daniel's life when things seem out of control?
Well, regardless of the news and what they say, the circumstances are get up, make your bed, right? Get your coffee and go about your day.
Yeah.
Period. Day in, day out. I recommend staying off the rapids. Responsibility. It's just that, putting one foot in front of the other, regardless of the fear people try to, the chicken little tactics that they use. Just ignore it.
Yeah.
And pay attention to the Bible, the Word of God.
Yeah, don't be blown around by the culture. Daniel is a perfect example. I think of a discipline in his life that is called out is his prayer, his consistent prayer, which is specifically attacked. Because what did they say? They couldn't find anything. I mean, what guy in government doesn't have baggage? Daniel somehow worked his way up, but what's the consistent? Why is it? God blessed Daniel, right? Daniel was faithful, though. And, no baggage on the guy. And then in the difficult moments, he prays and continues to pray. And so as a specific application for us, when we read the headlines, when we're tempted to think, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, ought we to practice the discipline of prayer? Daniel did it. He's called out as And did I put these verses in? He's actually commended, he's held out as a model in the book of Ezekiel, specifically. I think I mentioned this earlier. If I didn't, I think it's in the notes. He's called out in Ezekiel as kind of a model of righteousness, right alongside Noah and Job. So you have Noah, Daniel, Job. It's good company there. Okay. All right. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for this study. I pray that each one here would be encouraged, be excited about studying this book in more detail. I pray that they would go home and read it, ask questions, and I pray for each of us that we would grow in our confidence and our boldness and our courage because you are in control. And I pray that we would live faithful, godly, holy lives, and that we would develop disciplines in our lives that would keep us grounded and focused on you, and that we would not become distracted by all of the headlines and all of the things happening around us, that we would be faithful, that we would be ambitious, as Daniel was ambitious, but that we would be mostly ambitious for you and for your glory, that we would grow in faithfulness. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.